Hello and welcome to Roundtable. The US President Joe Biden says Russian President Vladimir Putin isn't joking when he talks about using nuclear weapons. There could be nuclear armageddon, claims Mr. Biden. And he says this: for the first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, we have a direct threat to the use of nuclear weapons if, in fact, things continue down the path they'd been going. Good to have your company. I'm David Foster. Well, the White House says that Mr. Biden's warning isn't based on new intelligence suggesting an imminent nuclear threat. So, is the West overestimating Putin's intentions, or will he end this war by using nukes? We go first to Vienna, and there we see Nikolai Sokov, Senior Fellow at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation, used to work at Russia's Foreign Ministry. In Washington, D.C., Mark Kimmitt, former Assistant Secretary of State for Political and Military Affairs, and in Northamptonshire, UK, Keir Giles, author of the soon-to-be-published Russia's War on Everybody and What It Means for You, Senior Consulting Fellow of the Russia and Eurasia Programme at Chatham House. I know you all think this is pretty unlikely that nuclear weapons will be used, but we're going to do a what-if. We're going to war game this. So can I ask you, first of all, Nikolai, what would drive Vladimir Putin so crazy that he presses the nuclear button?
The most obvious scenario is also the least likely scenario, and that is where NATO decided to directly go to war with Russia in Ukraine or elsewhere. And we know that NATO does not plan to do that. A more likely scenario is escalation of a very small crisis. There may be many options. Russian strike very near the Polish border, for example, so that some shards fly into Poland. It can be a confrontation of ships or aircraft over the Baltic Sea. Yes, I can see like 4 or 5 scenarios like that.
Okay, Keir, if it does get to that point and nukes are being used from the Russian side, how would they be used? Where would they be dropped? What would happen?
Well, first of all, I think it's worth stepping back and considering that that's not the only circumstance under which President Putin personally might consider nuclear use. Now, we're all agreed that there's no rational case for using nuclear weapons. There's nothing that would actually serve Russia's interest, militarily or politically. But let's not forget that Russia has done so much else that doesn't serve its own interest. We can argue all we like that it doesn't make sense to use nuclear weapons, but then it didn't make sense to invade Ukraine in the first place. And there have been plenty of other strategic miscalculations that Russia has done. And just this latest wave of escalation in Ukraine itself, the targeting of civilian critical infrastructure, stepping up attacks on energy and power systems purely in order to cause destruction and to cause misery in Ukraine, points to this driving instinct that apparently guides some of Russia's decisions just to lash out and cause wanton destruction, whether or not it actually has a strategic aim. So we can argue all we like about whether there is, in fact, a military case for use of nuclear weapons, but let's not rule out the wild card, where President Putin may simply decide to lash out because he can cause suffering in Ukraine. Now, coming to that second point of your question, how exactly might it look? There's been a lot of focus lately on demonstrative strikes, on the single detonation of a small nuclear weapon, a tactical or low-yield nuclear weapon, possibly in Ukraine, possibly over an unpopulated area like an expanse of ocean, purely to make the point and serve as a warning shot from Russia to the rest of the world to back off. But let's not forget that's not the only way in which tactical nuclear weapons can be used. On both sides during the Cold War, these were intended to be fired in salvos to influence the outcome of a campaign or an operation. So we shouldn't forget that that too is an option. If Russia simply does want to destroy Ukraine because the reasoning goes, if Russia can't have it, then nobody can, then we shouldn't rule out that possibility as the madman's last resort.
Mark Kimmitt, you were at the State Department. I first met you when you were general. Mark Kimmitt. So let me ask you this from a military point of view. If what we've heard described so far does happen, what will be the response?
Well, I think at this point, those plans are already being developed and being looked at time after time again. I think what you would see is a massive response on the part of NATO. I don't necessarily think it would be a tit-for-tat nuclear response, but you can imagine that inside of Ukraine, every Russian command post, every Russian major formation, every Russian supply depot would be attacked. I think not only would that happen, but I think it would be attacked by systems that up to this point have been deemed to be impermissible by NATO. Longer range rockets, airstrikes with NATO aircraft, and any number of weapons that up to this point a red line has been drawn. So I think should Russia decide to use tactical nuclear weapons, which I think is not an issue of rationality or irrationality, but an issue of Russian military policy. I think if they decided to use it, the response would be massive, it would be quick, but I don't think it would be nuclear.
Okay, so I mean, there was the US National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, who said it would be a catastrophic consequence. What about the idea that I think you've just postured that it would be military targets, first of all? What about the possibility of cyber attacks on crucial Russian infrastructure that would actually cripple the country, such as the railway network? 80% of all goods travel via train through Russia. That would be escalation, or would that be proportionate?
Oh, I think that would be escalation because although we would probably increase the strikes inside of Ukraine and the capability and the systems used to attack those targets, I think there would still be a red line drawn at this point on attacking Russia proper. I think you can see the reaction of NATO when the Crimea Bridge was attacked, which was considered part of Russia proper. So I think they would try to have a devastating attack, but limited inside the battlefield area of Ukraine.
Nikolai, let me come to you, if I may, to ask you specifics about the Russian military at the moment. Let's go through some figures. I think Russia's got just under 6,000 nuclear weapons, NATO just under 6,000 again, slightly fewer than Russia. Then way down the list, we have China, Pakistan, India, Israel, and North Korea as the nuclear-armed countries. But 5,977 nuclear weapons, that is just an estimate for Russia, and suggestions that everything is perhaps very out of date, that it might not work. But when you've got that many, does it matter if only 3 work?
Yes, I would say it would not be very wise to try and check that. That said, the Russians do actually have the program to sustain its nuclear stockpile. So these weapons are refurbished, components replaced. Oh yes, and there is a zero-yield testing going on Novaya Zemlya. That's the main test range quite regularly. That's been going on since 2000. So I'm pretty sure that at least the vast majority of that stockpile actually works.
What about this? It has escalated. This is hypothesis. It has escalated. Things are getting very nasty. How do we know? What would we, or the West, or intelligence services, or the military be looking for to see that it is getting to the point of no return? Telltale signs.
Well, first and foremost, this will not go nuclear right away, by far. Well, of course, assuming at least a degree of rationality out on side of Moscow, because if they're completely irrational, then this conversation does not really make sense, right? But if they are irrational in their own way, then we'll start by seeing increasing threats, more kind of signaling. Yes, I would say that when political signals go military, which it will begin with conventional actually weapons. The last resort before nuclear use will be an underground nuclear test Well, at least that's my expectation. So we'll see plenty of actually warning signs even before nuclear weapons begin to get released from storage facilities.
Okay, General Kimmitt, if I could refer to you as that, in this instance, what would the West's or NATO's planners be looking at from above to think, what would lead them to think that something crazy was in the offing?
Right. Well, first of all, I would agree with Nikolai in terms of the intentions. What he was referring to are the intentions of both sides to determine if one was going to use or the other. But I think we also need to talk about capabilities, and that's discrete physical capabilities for them to get the nuclear warheads to where they need to be. It is typical. I actually was in units that cannon artillery, which had the capability to fire nuclear rounds. We kept the nuclear capability materials completely separate from the location where we had the cannons. It was very clear that if there was practice or in fact actual use, that you would have to connect the two, which are separated by physical distance. I would expect that the NATO intelligence services have a pretty good fix on where those nuclear warheads or cannon shells are being stored. So I think that's probably the number one PIR, the number one priority intelligence requirement that NATO and its other allies are watching right now.
Give us an idea. Give us an idea. Sorry to butt in. Give us an idea, because we've all seen pictures of these 15-meter monsters that are paraded through the streets of Moscow. We know what comes out of the top of a submarine. Give us an idea how small, how nimble these the battlefield weapons can be.
Well, I would tell you, David, that in the 50s and early 60s, we had what we called the Davy Crockett. It was a nuclear round fired from a recoilless rifle, which was the size of a javelin. It was that small. Now, our own policy had us pull those away, so there was a clear fire break between conventional and nuclear. So at the first level, we would see it at 155 millimeter cannons. We had some specialty items that were carried on backpacks, but primarily what I would expect to see is they use their cannon artillery to deliver a tactical artillery round of about 152 millimeters, probably about 100 pounds. Those are pretty small relative to those big missiles you were talking about.
Extraordinary. I had no idea. Keir, I'm going. Oh, hang on. Nikolai wants to say something. Then I'm going to play something from Sergei Lavrov, and then you will come back in, please. Keir, Nikolai.
Yes, just to clarify, as far as I understand, Russia no longer has nuclear artillery, same as the United States. So we're talking about warheads for Iskander missiles, for Caliber missiles, and similar actually. So they're slightly bigger, although not by much. But in any event, you see some movement at storage sites. All these storage sites are extremely well known. So,
okay.
So yes.
Keir, let's hear from you after Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister.
Президент неоднократно высказывался.
The Russian president has said repeatedly that our nuclear doctrine envisages exclusively retaliatory measures intended to prevent the destruction of the Russian Federation as a result of direct nuclear strikes or the use of other weapons that threaten the very existence of the Russian state.
Now, Keir, we are guessing that Vladimir Putin has gone beyond the stage of reacting to a Western nuclear strike because it hasn't happened. Something else has tipped him over the edge. How devastating do you think these attacks would be? Are they so isolated that they just make a statement and leave a small radioactive area rather than massive civilian casualties and damage to infrastructure that would take years to repair?
Well, again, if we're thinking of the actions that Russia could undertake, as we've already established in this conversation, we're not talking about a rational calculation of risks and benefits. Instead, it is some irrational action, and as such, it's even less predictable than all of the other options we've already been talking about. But let me just re-emphasize what we heard in the conversation just a few minutes ago, which is that there are so many steps that have to be taken between now and an actual real potential for nuclear use. You mentioned the comment from Sergei Lavrov. They're referring back to Russia's actual nuclear doctrine. What's become confused here is the difference between the doctrine, the actual, what the armed forces think about what nuclear weapons are for and can even be useful for, and the rhetoric, the intimidation, the propaganda, the way in which the nuclear threat has been leveraged to try to constrain Western behaviors, and actually has done so very successfully. You see time and again Western leaders referring specifically to these Russian nuclear threats when justifying lack of support for Ukraine or holding back from providing Ukraine with war-winning materials. So as far as Russia is concerned, this works, and they're actually getting good results just from talking about nuclear weapons before getting anywhere near actually using them.
Nikolai, let me ask you this. In the United States, in the United Kingdom, any two countries that I followed it in this regard closely, the Prime Minister or the President has ultimate authority. They are the ones that says go when it comes to nuclear war. In Russia, as I've been led to believe in the last few months, there is a chain of command that begins perhaps with the president, but has to go through the military and the generals, and they would be the ones who eventually said yes or no. That kind of fail-safe, do you think that could prevent this sort of thing if it came to Vladimir Putin saying time to go? Somebody might say no.
Well, let me first actually respond to something that has just been said. I do not think that we've established that Moscow is irrational. Well, it's actually rational just in its own way. Yes, and we just need to understand how they think. With respect to nuclear chain of command, yes, it used to be the Soviet procedure that the order from the top can be countermanded. I don't believe that procedure is still in force now. Well, I'm pretty certain that Vladimir Putin, just given his tendency to concentrate all power within his own hands, has already changed that procedure to be the same as the United States. So basically, the chief executive gives an order, and the order must be implemented. So if someone interferes, it will be at that person's own actual risk and own decision.
Goodness gracious. Okay, I had no idea. Thank you very much for that. Mark Kimmitt, General Kimmitt, got a magazine here that talks about the possibility of the threat, and there's a bit in it that says, a nuclear Russia in the hands of an angry warlord or ripped apart by civil war is arguably even more terrifying. In other words, if Putin goes, even if he doesn't use nuclear weapons, if for some reason he is disposed of, he loses support, somebody takes him out, there is a far more worrying situation with other people who many would consider to be real crazies in charge.
No, that's exactly right. And candidly, that's some of the worries that we've had in other countries around the world. Pakistan, for example, what would happen if the military government was taken over by, as you would say, a hostile or radical organization? So I think that people have thought through this considerably in other countries, but I don't think they've thought through that in Russia. And that is a concern. And hopefully that there are some plans in place to not only account for that in other countries, but also in Russia as well.
What about conventional weaponry? I've also read that the arsenal, if you like, is getting low, that some of the re-equipping isn't happening fast enough, that what's getting to the battlefield isn't good enough. And if that area starts to run low, is there a concern that the only way out of it for Vladimir Putin and the high command would be to go down the nuclear route because they've got no other option?
If you're asking me that question, I think the answer is they will not get that low where Vladimir Putin, I would think, would have to resort to nuclear weapons. Significant amount of artillery ammunition that they have inside their country. Now, they may not have the most precise weapons still available, but I think you can tell that the war inside of Ukraine right now is no longer one of precision and candidly no longer one of battlefield tactics. I think what we've been seeing over the past few days has turned this in some regards into a strategic bombing campaign where the goal is not taking territory or defeating forces, but intimidating and terrorizing populations and going against infrastructure. That can easily be done by dumb bombs delivered by aircraft, which is why it's so important that we get the air defense systems in there. But David, I just don't believe it's going to be to the point where the Russians run out of ammunition, particularly when they can get all they need from places such as North Korea.
Okay. Keir, let me come to you on this one, and indeed you others may also want to add to it. We've been talking, I've learned today that it's possible to have a nuclear device the size of a bow and arrow effectively, but a darn sight more dangerous than a bow and arrow. How much would it take for these very small devices used on the battlefield, perhaps delivered via artillery, to be replaced by the absolute monsters because something else has gone wrong, and that what was an isolated incident becomes effectively an east-west nuclear conflict? How dangerous is that possibility if we're even talking about the smallest nuclear strike?
Well, first of all, let's make absolutely sure that we know that when Mark refers to 1950s nuclear weapons the size of a javelin, I suspect he's referring to the Javelin anti-tank missile rather than a spear that you would throw. But still, you're absolutely right. These were extremely compact devices that were available, and it would be surprising if that technology had gone away altogether. But there is also a clue to some of the other steps of escalation that Russia could still take before resorting to nuclear weapons. With or without running out of conventional munitions, there are plenty of other things that Russia could do to cause damage and intimidation and destruction within Ukraine itself or across Europe. Because let's not forget, Russia's already used chemical and radiological weapons in different European countries in the period well before 2022. But in terms of your question about escalation and different types of nuclear use, that is the reason why the prospect of any kind of nuclear use today is such a dramatic one, because it crosses a threshold, because it breaks a taboo, because it unleashes inevitable global proliferation of nuclear weapons of a kind that Russia would certainly not want to see. Because as soon as Russia does resort to nuclear use to get its way, there is no other logical way for small countries around the world to defend themselves against Russia or against anywhere else than to acquire their own nuclear weapons. So this would unleash processes that would be absolutely catastrophic over and above the direct effects on Russia itself of retaliation from Western countries.
Nikolai, we're coming towards the end of the programme. I had a conversation probably in March with the defence minister of an Eastern European country who suggested taking the conflict to Putin rather than waiting for him to deliver it to his particular country. Now, that smacks to me of dangerous escalation, if not provocation. But I wonder if this was reflecting a view that you think might be held across Europe that could be very dangerous, that we need to hurt him because eventually he might hurt us.
Well, I would say that that's a very dangerous course of action, because it's very hard to get to Putin personally. Yes, and if you try to do that, then fail, then of course, that's exactly the situation when you use nuclear weapons. Even if you succeed, then there will be others around Putin who might respond in the same way. Well, I mean, people might be actually very happy to see to see Putin go and say actually thanks to NATO, but behind closed doors, can still respond. By the way, to the discussion that we had before about low stocks of conventional weapons, you actually could see that roughly by the middle of the summer, actually Russia did run out of the stock of cruise missiles. in the use of cruise missiles, conventional, of course, it almost dried out, literally just single digits. Clearly, they spent, well, about 3 months to replenish the stockpile. Now they're using them again at significant scale. So I would not actually expect them to fully kind of...
Okay. Thank you. Mark, I'm going to come to you for a final word because we've talked mostly about Putin here. But was Joe Biden wrong or right to warn of Armageddon? Was it a foolish thing to do or was it necessary?
Well, I think he would probably like to take back his words. David, one thing that I would mention is a point that Giles made about opening the threshold and lowering the threshold. This is not just about Russia and the West. This is also about any other country that has nuclear weapons, Pakistan, India, North Korea, South Korea, that if all of a sudden we see them used in Ukraine by Russia, and it's not the end of the world, it may actually be an incentive for other countries to use this, understanding that it will not result in thermonuclear war between their countries. So that's as big a danger that this would be. If you hadn't frightened me enough already,
then you certainly did with that final statement. Thank you very much indeed, General Kimmitt. Nikolai, thank you very much indeed. Keir, your book coming out fairly soon, Russia's War on Everybody. Thank you for coming on the program. Thank you for watching it. Wherever you are, from me, David Foster, and the Roundtable team. Goodbye.